One of the problems of not writing a script fully in doing these is that I have often to make 2 or 3 attempts. This is actually the 5th attempt to get it right. And I was going so well on the 4th attempt when I realised that I forgot to put my headphones on and my microphone. So when I played it back, I looked really good and I looked really knowledgeable, but you could hardly hear what I was saying. So anyway, with that, hopefully 5 is the time to get it finished. It's good that you could join with me. Thank you for sticking with this as we explore together a wee bit of the life of St. Paul. I say explore together. This is not a deep Bible study. This is simply a flavour, a painting a picture of Paul. And you can read through the stories in more detail as I go on. So far we've thought of Paul as a young man, of his pride in his being born in Tarsus and his fact that he was a Roman citizen, which would come back to be very important later in life. We talked about his early life moving from Tarsus in Syria to Jerusalem, because Saul was such a bright, able, committed young man that he needed to be challenged, and he went to the best schools, the best training, and he trained as a Pharisee. We talked about him rising up through the ranks because of his skill, his knowledge, his determination. And we talked about him being a persecutor of the early Christians, known as people of the way. He persecuted the people in Jerusalem with the hope that he would wipe out this cancer, as he saw it, of a disease that was infecting those who went to synagogues and who believed in God through the traditional way. But actually, what he did was, as he persecuted, others fled and went to other nations, other cities. And so they took with them the stories of Jesus. And in that way of persecution, freedoms grew and stories were told. And maybe there's an example there of when the church is at its best, when it's under times of trial and persecution and threat, that the Spirit lives on in the hearts of those who believe. He'd gone round Jerusalem, he'd gone to the synagogues, he had people arrested, imprisoned, he had them threatened to give up their faith. But that wasn't enough for this zealot young man. He had to go to other nations, other parts. And he got letters from the leaders of the Jewish High Council in Jerusalem to go to a city of Damascus, where he'd heard that there were new people of the way in the synagogues there. And it was on the way to Damascus, which was about a 3-day trip. It was about 200 miles, that we heard last time that he saw the light. That the light blinded him, he fell to his knees. The voice said, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And Saul in his blindness said, "Who is it?" "It is Jesus whom you persecute." We're told that Saul was blind for 3 days until God used as an instrument of his grace a man named Ananias, who was a follower of the way in Damascus. And I want to read you just a wee bit from that passage. And I read this the last time we met, or at least the last time I filmed. And it's from Acts at chapter 9. And it's just after God has spoken to Ananias and told him what he must do. Ananias isn't sure. "Lord, many people have told me about this man, about all the terrible things he has done to your people in Jerusalem. And he has come to Damascus with authority from the chief priests to arrest all who worship you." The Lord said to him, "Go, because I have chosen him to serve me, to make my name known to Gentiles and kings, and to the people of Israel. I have made him I have chosen him, it said, to make my name known to Gentiles and kings and to the people of Israel. And that's so important as we begin to think about Saul, who became Paul's journeys, as he would spread the message. So, Saul has had his eyes cleansed, the scales fell off, what felt like scales. He was baptized. And as he had planned to do, he went and visited the synagogues where he was welcomed because they were expecting him. But they didn't expect the message. Rather than condemning the way, Saul would talk about the way of Jesus Christ. And while he was welcomed in some, soon they got fed up of hearing the story, and soon they got so angry that they were trying to kill him. And he had to be rescued and flee from Damascus at that time, lowered in a basket out a window of the city wall. It was a strange story. You can find this in Acts chapter 9. And then there's a time span. It's a time span of approximately 3 years. We don't know for certain. There's no calendar that has the dates marked fully. But scholars have different times. People say different times, but most of this happened between about late 30s AD to about the early 60s AD. So there's 25 years or so of time. After he was lured out, according to Galatians, he went to Arabia. Nobody knows where Arabia is. They think it must just be land near Damascus. And he spent some time there as the dust settled again after the outrage that he caused, before he returned to Damascus and continued there for about 3 years. Again, you can read this in Galatians 1:11 to 18. Paul then came to Jerusalem, where he was assisted by Barnabas. He went to Jerusalem after his time in Damascus because he felt called. He wanted to become part of the new people of the way. But the apostles, even though he'd been gone for 3 years, his name and his reputation were still solid, and they didn't trust him. But Barnabas, one of the church leaders, he took him under his wing. He convinced the apostles to speak to Paul, and Paul started to preach in the synagogues in Jerusalem. But as so often happened in Saul or Paul's life, he preached for a while until he got them angry and his life was threatened. And so Barnabas and the other apostles, suggested that he would go back home to Tarsus. And there he would stay. He went to Tarsus and he worked, no doubt, as a tent maker, the skills that he'd learned in Jerusalem when he'd been training. He was a teacher of the way. No doubt he still continued to speak. And things settled down for a wee while, until Barnabas moved to Antioch. Antioch in Syria. There's 2 Antiochs. It's confusing. There's one in Syria, north of, a bit further up the coast from Jerusalem in the Syrian, and there's one in what we think of as Turkey. Barnabas went to Antioch to form a new Christian community. And he remembered Paul, or Saul, and called him back from Tarsus, and they established a church. And it's at this church in Antioch that this happens. And I'm going to read to you a few verses from Acts at chapter 13. In the church at Antioch, there were some prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon called the Black, Lucius from Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the governor, and Saul. While they were serving the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said to them, "Set apart from me Barnabas and Saul, to do the work to which I have called them." They fasted and prayed, placed their hands on them, and sent them off. Having been sent by the Holy Spirit, Barnabas and Saul went to Cilicia, and sailed from there to the island of Cyprus. When they arrived at I've just realised I don't have my glasses, that's why I'm struggling. When they arrived at Salamis, they preached the word of God in the synagogues. They had John Mark with them to help in their work. They went all the way across the island to Paphos. And the story continues. I'm sorry about stuttering. I should remember I need my glasses to read the scriptures. This was the start of the first missionary journey. Different people say it took different times. And it's not just a matter of jumping on a boat and sailing to a country. They went to the seaport, they boarded a boat, and the boats were flimsy. They weren't big liners, they weren't big cruise liners or anything. And they headed to Cyprus. And in Cyprus they landed on the east coast, and they had to work their way all the way through to Paphos, which was the seat of power. And when they went there, they ended up speaking to the governor. And eventually their message was heard and accepted. From Cyprus they got on another boat and went to Pamphylia, and then to the other Antioch in Pisidia. Again, you can find the story in Acts 13, following, from verse 13 onwards. They went down across Galatia. You might have heard me say Galatians in the way of a letter to pick up some of his early life. Galatia was more a region. It wasn't a city or a town. And they went to visit towns in Lycaonia, Iconium, Lystra and Derbe. They went through Pisidia and Pamphylia again, and they worked their way back to Persia. They went in a kind of circle. They went from Cyprus up to and then they went up into the countryside, visited some towns, and then they came back the same way, reaffirming the new churches, the new communities of the faithful as they returned to the boats. It was a fascinating time. And they went back by ship to Antioch in Syria, where they'd started the whole experience from. Now, it has to say, during this first missionary journey, as you maybe heard in that passage that I read to you, there was Barnabas, who was the leader. He was the main name. There was Saul, and there was John Mark. But when they reached from Cyprus, they reached Asia. They reached the town of Perga, which was a port. Something happened with John Mark. He didn't do what was asked. They had a falling out. He went back to Jerusalem. And Saul and Barnabas carried on. This was a difficult experience, because this would draw a division. This would cause them to fall out, Saul or Paul and Barnabas. And between that first journey and the second journey, they spent time in Syria. The Acts of the Apostles calls it a long time, in 1428. We don't exactly know when, probably a year. And they had to go, during this time, Paul and Barnabas and other companions, to Jerusalem to attend a council regarding the issues of Christians keeping the law of Moses. You may remember the story of Peter, of having that vision of the sheet coming down with all the animals of different types, and the voice saying, "Kill and eat," and he said, "I can't kill them, they're unclean." And when he woke, he was invited in a dream to go and visit a Gentile. He went and ate with them. And when he returned to Jerusalem, this story had gone to Jerusalem, and they were very upset. And at that point, there was a conflict going within the new people of the way, who would claim that you had to be Jewish first and Christians second. And so this Council of the Apostles sorted this one out, and Paul and Barnabas were able to tell of their experiences that Gentiles and Jews could be people of the way. This led to a second missionary journey. But it wasn't a second missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas. For as I say, they had a fallout. They had a fallout over a couple of things. Now, Paul, I think, if I'm honest, was a determined, almost liked his own way at times. I get the impression I could be doing him an injustice. And it's all part of God's plan, I'm sure of that. But Paul chose Silas to accompany him. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark, but Paul didn't trust him. Barnabas wanted to go on a boat and go to Cyprus and visit the same places they'd been before to enthuse them and encourage them and support them. But Paul wanted to go elsewhere. And so they divided and they split. And you can find this in chapter 15 onwards of the Acts. They went, rather than boat to Cyprus and round, they went across country. They visited the towns of Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, and at that point Timothy joined Paul and Silas. And they went through the regions of Phrygia and Galatia, and then on to the coast of Troas. It's a huge journey. It takes a couple of years. And it was here that, at Troas, that Paul received a vision, calling him to go across the Aegean Sea to Macedonia. And then he went down the coast of what we would call Greece. And he worked in Athens. He challenged the philosophers in Athens to try and tell them about God. Then he made his way to Corinth, where he met two women, Aquila and Priscilla, who were very important women in the Bible. You can read about that in Acts at chapter 18. And then from Corinth he went across the sea to Ephesus. And Ephesus would be a very important base for Paul. Then he took the ship back to Caesarea, visiting the church there, and returned back to Syrian Antioch. That was his base, that was his home, that was where he'd established the church. But he never really settled in these home places much, for he was called to do a third missionary journey. Now, we're talking about, the first one maybe 47, 48. Next one, 49, 52. We're now talking about 53, 54, up to 57. This was the longest of his journey because he would stay in Ephesus for a longer time. And there he would write some of his scriptures. He set off again. He visited the churches in Galatia and Phrygia. He returned to Ephesus, where his work caused uproar. He always seemed to have that effect. Then he revisited Macedonia and Greece, came to Troas, and then from Miletus, Paul sailed to Caesarea, and then on to Jerusalem. This was the last of his official journeys, his missionary journeys. Some say he had a fourth missionary journey, and I'm not convinced by that argument, but I wouldn't deny it. I just think that I'm going to concentrate on the traditional, the old-fashioned concept of 3 missionary journeys. And in Jerusalem, Paul had a meeting with James and the elders. James had become leader of the new way, the church. He talked with them about the work. He was a source of trouble for the Jews. He told his story publicly and got nearly flogged. He went on trial and is escorted to Caesarea. He was imprisoned. He was beaten. And only then did he declare that he was a Roman citizen, that he could appeal to Caesar. And he began the journey to Rome. He sails to Rome under escort. And on the way, just outside Malta, the ship is shipwrecked. And eventually he's rescued and from Malta travels to Rome. And he's in a mixture of house arrest and prison arrest in his time in Rome. And from Rome he writes many of his pastoral letters. And from Rome, the centre of the world, the stories of the way began to spread all over the world. God had called him right from the start when Ananias questioned, "Are you doing the right thing, God? This man wants to persecute." He said, "He shall take my message to the Gentiles and to the kings." And he really did. But more than that, he wrote stuff down. He wrote stories. He solved questions. He was one who would be, for us, a most important theologian. And next time I meet, we'll look at some of his letters in more detail. We don't exactly know what happened in Rome. There is different stories, and some have suggested after his trial and he was acquitted, he stayed in Rome, met with Peter, and they taught and enhanced the life of the people of the way. Some suggest he may have even gone, as he always wished to do, go further west and travel to Spain. But we've no real evidence of that. He would die a faithful servant of God, his work complete. The work that he was called to do, one who would take my name to the Gentiles and the kings and the people of Israel. All of this in about 30 years of ministry. Saul and Paul. And next week, as I say, we shall think about some of the letters that he wrote to us. The legacy that he left, not just of his ministry, but of the way of the faith. Thank you for journeying with me. Take care of yourself, and in your own way, take care of others. And if you want to read the story in more detail, please look at the book of Acts. You'll find most of it. I mean, you'll find stories of the first missionary journey between chapters 13 and 15. You'll find the second missionary journey between chapters 15 and 18. You'll find the third missionary story between 18 and 21. You'll find his time in Jerusalem and Caesarea in chapters 21, 24, 26. And finally his journey to Rome, 27 to 28. It's not a lot of reading, but there's a lot to take in. And I've only briefly touched the surface of the journeys that Paul would take as he spread the message to the Gentiles, to the kings, and yes, to the people of Israel in the synagogues where he visited. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.